The story begins with the immense and powerful king of the dead, about to face the noble and glorious knight of light, both ready to decide the fate of the world. However, the protagonist, who watches from a corner of the screen, thinks that the fight looks more like a play than a real battle. He says that it is all a game after all. He is the great noble predictor who finds himself without action, wondering how he got to this point. That very morning, someone knocks on his door. It was an investigator from the Superpower Transmission Investigation Division, who asks him if he is Foon, and the protagonist confirms. The investigator then tells him that, if he has any superpowers to report, he should do so before wishing him a good day and leaving. As he closes the door, the protagonist reflects on the fact that he has not opened that door for at least 6 months. Looking at the food he has at home, he realizes that everything is expired. He thinks that it has been 2 years since he has stepped outside, that he has isolated himself from the world, and that perhaps people call him pathetic or a weakling without courage. But he himself considers himself a victim of this. Meanwhile, the TV shows a news report about an emergency. A huge fire has taken over a commercial area, and firefighters are trying to extinguish the flames. They believe that the fire was caused by an awakened, a criminal who committed a random act before being transported to another world. The protagonist reflects on this awakened person who suddenly gained mysterious powers called superpowers. When they awaken to such powers, they are forced to be transported to another world within 24 hours, and they rarely manage to return. Many take advantage of this short time to do whatever they want, including committing crimes. 2 years ago, the protagonist lost his family and his leg because of one of these criminals. Trying to exercise on the leg curl, he realizes that he doesn't have the strength in his legs and gives up. Finding the situation pathetic, he questions why he is so terrified of leaving the house. If he had more courage, maybe his life would be different. But suddenly, a system message appears. A dimensional shift has been detected, and he is about to connect to the Uksha system, awakening a unique ability. The time counter is activated, 24 hours remaining. The protagonist is terrified. Why is all this happening all of a sudden? The system takes the key. If he does not transport himself voluntarily, he will be forced to go to the other world. He panics. He tries to escape from the system screen and runs to a deer. He remembers that some people took up to a year to return, and time there is 10 times slower than on Earth. This means that he would have to stay 10 years in the other world. Would he be able to survive? With only 3 minutes left to travel, the protagonist prepares himself, putting on clothes and putting on a huge backpack. Even so, he thinks it is impossible, that he has no powers or skills to survive. But suddenly, he remembers that he now has a skill with the power of the avatar. He screams to activate it, and before him appears a copy of himself. Both frightened, realize that they are sharing the same vision. The protagonist feels a headache and realizes that their minds are connected, making it difficult to move simultaneously. Time is running out, only 1 minute remains. The system warns again that if he does not transport himself of his own free will, he will be forced to go. The protagonist, frustrated, wonders why such a useless power fell into his hands. But, upon reflection, he realizes that he can send his crone in his place. The system confirms, and the teleportation begins. The crone is sent to the other world, but the protagonist, still conscious, wonders why he is there and not at home. The system warns that, in order to return to Earth, the protagonist will need to accumulate karma, which can be obtained through good or more actions in the other world. However, his karma is at 0. Then suddenly, the protagonist feels a headache and realizes that he is once again sharing his vision with the crone. He undoes the avatar, but the feeling of nausea worsens. Even so, he consoles himself with the thought that he managed to escape the teleportation to the other world. He summons the avatar again. The system informs him that he obtained a special reward for returning to Earth without using the karma store. He gained a dimensional teleportation field, which can be used once a day to return to his last location. The protagonist is surprised, and the system also warns that his callus has increased considerably. He can hardly believe how this was possible. The system's explanation reveals that karma is accumulated by impacts that the protagonist had in the other world, whether through good or bad acts. The protagonist has more karma than he needs to return to Earth. He wonders if this is a mistake, but what really matters is that he has managed to accumulate enough karma to change his luck. The protagonist is asked to return the karma, but he replies that he has done nothing wrong, so he is at ease. He thinks about the comm shop and decides to look at the status buff options. The first option that appears is health, and he realizes that for 10,000 karma points, he can improve his recovery. Curious about what this would mean, he decides to buy it. As he does so, he feels a pain in his legs and realizes that, for the first time in a long time, he can feel his legs again. He realizes that the wound on his leg, a deep scar that reminds him of his family's leg, is healing. The system informs him that he has surpassed the recovery limit and acquired the super recovery ability. Now, at night, he is able to do exercises on the leg curl with ease and realizes that he has not only healed, but he has become incredibly strong. He wonders what else he can do with the karma he still has left, until he sees a new option in the store, which costs 300,000 karma points, the unique strengthening ability. He wonders what would happen if he improved his avatar ability and decides to invest in it. Later, he analyzes his avatar and realizes that he looks healthier. The avatar comments on the protagonist's new shape, who proudly responds that it is the result of his effort. He realizes that, by strengthening his avatar ability, his consciousness is now divided in two, which allows him to move without feeling sick, as well as granting him a new ability, Mind Center, which filters stimuli and emotions, allowing him to receive only the desired information. This means that he will no longer get sick when changing dimensions. He tests the ability by punching the avatar, and when he sees that it does not feel pain, he feels more comfortable with the idea of exploring another world while staying at home. On the couch, he also thinks that if he continues to strengthen the ability, he could create more avatars. The avatars begin to think of names. The protagonist, looking at the coffee brand, he calls the first avatar frogs and the second one kidneys, like the ketchup brand. He thinks that, although the traits of frogs and kidneys seem mediocre, Hans has an affinity for magic and kidneys is more durable. It's time to focus on the main mission. While Hans is sent to another world, the avatar Renz goes for a walk around the city, carrying the accumulated trash of a human. Then he decides to go out for the first time in a long time. Reflecting that the center of the mind is working well, as he is managing to ignore the anxiety of leaving home, he notices that Van arrived safely in the other world, and in the meantime, sees the environment around him, a seemingly peaceful forest. But suddenly, a panther appears, attacking without hesitation. The protagonist draws his sword, and the panther, upon biting the blade, is surprised by the magical infusion he uses in his sword. After a few attempts, he manages to stick the blade in the panther's neck and kill it. He thinks he is still weak, and if another creature appears like that, he will be in trouble. However, in the distance he sees a village, and heads there. The village chief greets him warmly, praising his courage for crossing the forest full of creatures at night. The exhausted protagonist responds that he barely made it alive and asks if he can spend the night in the village. The chief promptly says yes and takes the opportunity to comment on the protagonist's equipment and clothes, which seems strange. The protagonist responds in a vain manner, saying that he is just wandering around the region and collecting what he can. The chief mentions that it has been a long time since he has seen foresters in the village, and invites him to have a drink at the tavern. Later, lying in a room, the protagonist reflects on how kind the people of the village have been to him. He realizes that, despite his difficult situation, perhaps he has found a place where things can be a little easier. The protagonist, still exhausted, begins to fall asleep. But in the meantime, something unusual begins to happen. It feels a presence approaching, and wonders what is going on. Meanwhile, in the original meme, the protagonist is in a tavern, relaxing with a beer. He reflects on his journey, training and eating as he travels, but feels a little guilty about the constant use of Hans' durability ability. He thinks it's good to be prepared for any unforeseen event, since he never knows when a fight will be necessary. However, he realizes that he needs to learn more about how to use his avatars. After all, he wants to become a perfect commander. Suddenly, he feels a strange sensation, something bizarre, and the system warns that Hans has died. All of Hans' accumulated traits have been reset, and the protagonist immediately makes the connection that someone probably put something in his drink in the village. He feels naive for having trusted so easily. The protagonist wonders if he is connected to his avatar, when the village chief reveals, without a second thought, Hans was transformed into an elite skeleton and undead, and that he had not been as useful as they had hoped. The protagonist, in shock, hears the system inform him that he was transformed into an undead, but that thanks to the mind center ability, his mind was not corrupted. He realizes that he is now among other undead, and begins to wonder if the entire village was transformed like this. As he tries to understand the situation, a person comes down to the basement where he is, and the protagonist recognizes that it is the same man he spoke to in the tavern the night before. This man, upon seeing him, seems uninterested and gives orders for the protagonist, or rather Hans, to move. Even though he is controlled by the force of a mysterious ability, the protagonist manages to partially resist, but feels that the energy that moves him is familiar, perhaps related to the affinity with magic that passes, and the protagonist, now accustomed to the situation, begins to practice magic. He concentrates and finally manages to control one of the skeletons that were within his reach. However, the skeleton begins to move clumsily, which makes the protagonist laugh, knowing that he is still perfecting his magic. But then he hears a noise, and when he looks at his foot, he finds a rat that had been bothering him for days. The protagonist, amused by his discovery, uses his flaming power to kill the rat, and to his surprise, the rat revives. He names the rat Alfred and sends him to investigate the warehouse where the undead are being kept. As Alfred does his work, the protagonist discovers, through his investigations, that there is an evil force emanating from the warehouse, a power so dangerous that they hesitate to approach. However, he continues to seek more information about what is happening there. In a conversation, the village chief mentions that there is something strange with the dark energy present in the bodies of some of the undead, which leads the protagonist to wonder if the origin of this energy is related to the immortal king. The situation becomes complicated when Alfred is hit and killed, and the protagonist feels he needs revenge. The protagonist then heads to the warehouse, determined to confront those who control the undead. When he enters the warehouse, he finds a tense environment, with the undead being controlled by a superior force. He demands to know who is controlling Alfred, and upon coming face to face with the leader, begins to question the intentions of this new threat. A fight ensues, but the protagonist realizes that the real fight is just beginning. The zombie, fallen on the ground, gets up with a sinister expression and lets loose the hunt. The people of the village are much more fun. At least I'll have fun with my wife, not with death. Don't blink. They get up with an agile movement and bite the neck of. Feeling the intense pain, Seth wonders, stunned, what is happening, while trying to order the monster to stop. But as nothing works, he starts to recite spells, invoking magic, until suddenly, another zombie appears behind him and grabs him. In seconds, all the undead around him begin to bite him, devouring his flesh. ZF, now in agony, he thinks that this is just the beginning and promises to blindfold all the victims. Simultaneously, the protagonist in the village sends another avatar there. He arrives furious and demands explanations from the guards, who had informed him that his brother had disappeared in that place. They try to send him away, but he insists on meeting with the village chief. Upon appearing, the chief is visibly surprised to see the protagonist's face, which is identical to that of his missing brother. The protagonist coldly says that his twin brother must be around there. Meanwhile, in the body of a skeleton, the protagonist reflects on the advantage of having two rooms. He feels that the distraction caused by Hans allowed him to reach the fragment of the immortal king, from which an overwhelming energy emanates. He begins to notice that the fragment is absorbing the energy of the undead, as if it were resonating, seeking other parts of the fragment. But when observing the undead, he realizes how powerful they seem. The place where they are, a warehouse, is full of defective products, and the protagonist decides that it is time for them to taste some of this merchandise. Without hesitation, he grabs the fragment, and the resonance triggers a huge explosion. At that moment, the other avatar, still talking to the village chief, tries to insist that they are twins. The chief, skeptical, begins to question himself, but Walbus feels something strange emanating from the fragment. At the same moment, the boss, in the form of an ethereal soul, orders the guards to kill the protagonist. But when the guards arm themselves, the protagonist has already disappeared, while the protagonist's avatar, in the body of the skeleton, feels a storm of negative emotions and a murderous desire intensely filtered through his mind. He begins to question whether a normal person would resist that pressure without going crazy. When the energy from the fragment enters your body, a huge explosion occurs, and the system informs you that you have reached the power needed to evolve. Is now an immortal wizard, or a demolic with dark magic abilities, thanks to the fragment of the immortal king. Meanwhile, a subordinate comments that Zay was an idiot for not being able to deal with a simple mouse and that now the problem was theirs. When someone calls out to Huyen, it responds telepathically, but his master instructs him to stop fiddling and check the fragment. He follows the order and starts looking for Pozov, who is in the basement, but wonders why he doesn't respond. Suddenly, something teleports there and he thinks it's CF. But upon investigating, several undead begin to come out of a door. The protagonist, in a sarcastic tone, says that the weather is great today. It's not bad and it's shocking. Asking how the skeleton can speak, desperate, he begins to prepare black magic and tries to get away from the creatures. However, the door falling on him makes the protagonist scoff, saying that he did not respond to the greetings politely. He, now with evil wisdom, can perfectly understand the dark magic around him. An explosion occurs and he orders the undead to leave no one standing, killing all humans present. Meanwhile, the protagonist watches the explosions and wonders what is happening. The village chief approaches, recognizing the elite skeleton and asking how he managed to obtain the fragment of the immortal king. The protagonist, with a smile, responds that it has been a long time since he saw him and mentions that, thanks to the lost his heart, and since then, he began searching for its fragments. The boss, furious, asks how the protagonist managed to use the mortal king's fragment with that weak and insignificant body. He then prepared a powerful spell to finish him off once and for all, using a deadly spell called Finger of Death, a laser of black magic that hits the protagonist's left arm, cutting it off completely, making it fly away. The protagonist, with an ironic smile, comments that the boss is not very polite to attack while he is still talking. The boss, angry, tells him to shut up, revealing that he had invested all his resources in a long maturation process that lasted an entire year, and they were about to gain immense power, stronger than anything. But now, everything was lost because of him. In response, the boss invokes the spell of darkness, and the protagonist is hit. But he feels like a newbie is using advanced magic. The protagonist jokes, saying that he managed to resist the spell, but the boss didn't. The determined boss. He says he doesn't know how he resisted the corrosion of the fragment, but that he will finish him off right there. He uses a spell called Vector Plasmas towards the protagonist, but the protagonist responds that saying the names of the spells is too irritating. He then reveals that it is time to kill the boss and summons Alfred, the boss. Confused, Keen asks Alfred if he has infiltrated the village, but Waldo senses the presence of dark magic behind him. He barely manages to defend himself in time, but realizes that the protagonist is adapting very quickly to dark magic. He wonders if this has something to do with the fragment, but with no time to waste, the boss uses another spell. At that moment, one of the boss's subordinates, who was fighting the undead, begins to have his soul sucked out, and soon all the souls of the humans there too. The protagonist realizes that the souls of the necromancers are being consumed. The village chief, wearing a crown called the Crown of the Broken, strengthens himself with the souls of his subordinates. He says that, although the protagonist has become stronger due to the fragment, he still won't be able to surpass it, and will die there. But suddenly, the boss is hit in the chest by a high-precision shot, which makes the protagonist scoff, saying that he almost slept with him saying the name of each spell. The chief, already seriously injured, falls dead with a hole in his chest, while the protagonist wonders if Alfred is seeing that. He had finally avenged his friend, and could now rest in peace. Meanwhile, in a large cathedral, a woman prays and feels a strange presence. She runs to find a bishop, who asks her if she has finished her prayers. This woman is Saint Riesta, and she says she felt signs that the immortal king was reborn in the West. Bishop, frightened, calls a meeting immediately, and Jacinta thinks to herself that she will not allow this to happen again. She remembers with awe the immortal king, who spread terror across the continent years ago, and decides that he will not let it bring him any more destruction. Meanwhile, the protagonist walks through the massacre of humans and undead. He notes that most of the undead he was controlling have died, but consoles himself, saying that he can only recruit more undead for his army. This is the power of a necromancer. However, he realizes that he still has no arm, so he finds a skeleton and rips off its arm, saying that it must be alive. Using his super recovery ability, the arm regenerates quickly and the protagonist comments that it is time to increase his army again. He decides that the soldier who was in front of him will become his subordinate, and with the evil wisdom and the fragment of the immortal king, he feels he has enough power to give consciousness to an undead person. However, when he tries, he ends up crumbling the skeleton, leaving him surprised and wondering why the magic didn't work. After some adjustments, he manages to recruit an army of undead again, and comments that, despite the initial failures, he is starting to get the hang of it. The protagonist then looks at the body of the village chiefs, reflecting that it is time to pick up your soul to extract some information. However, when he tries, he realizes that it is not working. He wonders if the village chief has no soul, and soon concludes that the magic circle on his chest must have sucked his soul out. He thinks that maybe there is an organization behind this, trying to hide the secrets related to the fragment. The protagonist understands that this makes sense, given the magnitude of this grand plan, but decides that he can still use the boss's body. Using the remains of the boss's body, the protagonist creates an undead with great combat power and consciousness. When the new being, now called Malcolm, wakes up, he introduces himself to the protagonist, who is impressed. Malcolm, apparently in a state of servitude, says that he is at the orders of his master. The satisfied protagonist asks if he heard and in response slaps Malcolm in the face, who immediately responds affirmatively. The protagonist then thinks coldly that he does not feel sorry for Malcolm. The protagonist begins to reflect on the memories he has lost, especially the bad acts he committed. And with him now, he is sure he would have fun torturing that enemy. However, he decides not to follow that path immediately. Instead, calls Malcolm and observes the Death Wizard's staff, considering its usefulness. Later, he ends up using the staff and thinks about the zombie that helped devour Zeph, asking that this zombie, "Finally, may you rest with your family in death." He then burns all the bodies, releasing the souls. About that, in the original world zone, the protagonist's original body is at home, peacefully eating and drinking. He takes out his cell phone and decides to check the price of gold, since, after massacring everyone in the village, found a valuable treasure. He then summons Hans to help him transport the gold, but upon seeing him in his terrifying form, he dispels the summons, thinking that the feeling of impending doom. However, he needs frogs again, so he decides to strengthen his abilities. He accesses the karma store, where he realizes that as he accumulates more karma, his mental strength increases, and he gains a new ability called Sphere as Clear as Water, which protects him from mental attacks. With an enhanced skill, he feels that he is stronger and that Hans can now be of great help. He goes to customs to sell the gold and transfer the money, being admired by everyone as he leaves the place. However, as a precaution, he hides Hans in the shadows, putting a mask on him, although I don't think it turned out very well. The moment he leaves the place, an explosion occurs behind him and a wolf-like creature appears, revealing that he had stolen gold that the protagonist had just sold. The store goes into panic, with people calling for police help. But the protagonist, reflecting on villains who commit crimes with their special abilities, thinks about the heroes who should protect them. The villains, confident, they announce that the Guardians will not arrive in time and head for a portal. But when they arrive, they discover that it has been dismantled. The villains notices the presence of Hans, unconscious, and asks if he is a guardian, but the protagonist, inside his current body, he knows he can't do anything, so he summons an army of undead to deal with the situation. Hans's body reacts, feeling that this body is different, and soon a group of guardians from the Korean Association arrives at the scene. Shocked to see the villains unconscious, team leader wonders who would have defeated the villains, giving orders to look for him responsible. Meanwhile, the protagonist watches everything with satisfaction, feeling that releasing stress in that way is not so bad. In another world, Thanes has apparently reached his promised destination, a city that should be a safe place. But when you arrive, you discover that it is empty, With no open shops or checkpoint, he hears noise coming from an alley and comes across a group of men intimidating a young woman. They demand 3 silver coins from her, or she will not be helped. The protagonist feels the cliché, doesn't want to get involved. But as he leaves the alley, the young woman bumps into him and apologizes repeatedly. He, not wanting to get involved, asks if she knows the city and, seeing an opportunity, decides to hire her. The young woman, surprised and excited to see the money, agrees, and he says that now it will be time to discuss the terms of the contract. The scene ends with Dorota, already hired, at night, waiting for the next stage of this strange partnership. The protagonist and Joanna go about their routine, and she shows him a place that seems comfortable enough. She asks if he liked the space, and he, although thoughtful, remember your situation and how that situation was helpful for both of you. Diana, a young woman who lost her parents and is struggling financially, has been hired to guide him around the city in exchange for a few silver coins or more. In the middle of the night, he wakes up feeling uncomfortable due to the uncomfortable bed. When he hears someone sneezing outside, he realizes that Diana has a cold. She appears smiling, and he scolds her, asking her not to show up so soon again. They then have coffee, and the protagonist, still sleepy, gives some instructions. Diana, in turn, is polite and respectful, and the protagonist notices that something about her is different. During the conversation, he notices that she saves a piece of bread instead of eating it, and becomes curious about this attitude. The city where they are, called Azul, is a small town in the Kingdom of Italy, located in the western part of the continent. The protagonist observes that the city has a medieval air, with a mysterious symbol scattered throughout. Diana reveals that the symbol is not ink but blood. When he asks how she knows this, she replies that she identified the symbol from the deer meat he had eaten, and, with her heightened sense of smell, also recognized the protagonist, surprised by Diana's talent, asks what the symbol means, and she explains that they represent an organization called Barcolac, which controls the city streets. As they talk, Diana suddenly stops. Smelling is smell, and the protagonist, curious, asks what it is. She replies that it is just the smell of fresh bread, a banality that makes the protagonist question its importance of something more serious. Diana, with a smile, insists that simple food is still something that deserves his attention. They continue the day passing through alleys and houses, until a few days later, the protagonist finds himself guarding Diana, who is late. When he starts to worry, a group of bandits approaches him, offering a conversation. Upon realizing that he is being approached by criminals, the protagonist prepares himself for something more serious. He offers some silver coins, trying to negotiate, but he soon realizes that the bandits carry the same symbol as Barcolac. The situation starts to get tense, and the protagonist remembers Diana's words about getting out of town soon. At that moment, the criminals comment on a child, and the protagonist, worried, he realizes that this child is Diana's brother. Madam, before you can ask any more questions, Diana appears behind him, and the tension between them and the bandits increases. After an exchange of words, the bandits leave, and the frustrated protagonist complains about Diana's delay. With teary eyes, she reveals that her brother has disappeared, and that despite taking care of him with great effort, unable to find him, the protagonist, now more aware of the gravity of the situation, suggests that the Barcolac organization may have taken Diana's brother, an idea that makes her despair. She explains that if the organization really caught him, he will probably die. Diana reveals a shocking truth about the city. Tila is a kind of farm for vampires, and the organization Took Lock, along with other groups, is controlled by these creatures. The protagonist is surprised and confused, questioning how come there are vampires, since no one has ever survived trying to escape from their parallel in a distant location. The vampire who leads the organization feels a presence of dark magic. He wonders if this has anything to do with the fragment of the deadly kidney he wants to obtain. The protagonist, faced with all this, realizes that there is much more happening in this city than he imagined, and the mission that seemed simple has now taken a dark and dangerous turn. As Jiren walks away with his brother, the protagonist tries to instill some hope in her. She, however, is aware of the reality of her situation. He says that no matter how much he does his best to maintain, if she was out of danger, she and her little brother would end up dying there. The protagonist, visibly uncomfortable with this prospect, he holds her face firmly and finds the reason, saying that if it is true, then there is no time to waste. She then asks if he will help rescue her brother, but makes sure to warn him that this is almost impossible, even for him. He, determined, answers that he doesn't care about that because he's good at dealing with the kind of people they're facing. The protagonist thinks that, for the first time, he had a real mission to help an unlucky girl rescue her brother. Meanwhile, in a small bar in the city, some men are betting and talking about a large amount of money that mysteriously appeared. One of the men, bald and criminal-looking, laughs, saying that the money was taken from a brat, the protagonist. Next, the protagonist enters the bar with a serious and determined expression, and someone stands up to confront him. The man starts to mock, asking who that sucker was. But the protagonist wastes no time and with a quick movement, sticks a knife in his attacker's throat. He then says that he knows well the type of squad he is dealing with, people who destroy families out of pure greed. With a smile, he thinks that one less enemy is on the way, and that there are still 2 to go. The other criminals, surprised by the protagonist's speed and coldness, try to react, but the protagonist is already ready. He has impressive combat skills, which include recovery and resistance. Even with a kidney body, he has great fighting skills. He ends up missing an attack and opens his guard for a moment, being hit by a knife. However, the blade does not penetrate as if it were hitting metal. The surprised bandit asks why, but before he can react, the protagonist knocks him down with a gun butt, stating that he is wearing a Korean bulletproof vest. Then, another bandit tries to attack from behind, but the protagonist defends himself with a magic barrier and, in a quick movement, stabs the man. The protagonist smiles, thinking that it was a good thing he brought those magical artifacts with him. When he believes he has already won, more bandits appear and the protagonist, tired and starting to lose count of the enemies he has already taken down, continues the fight, defeating one after the other. Finally approaches one of the fallen men and asks, out of patience, where is the boy they took? The bald man, laughing, refuses to speak and begins to provoke the protagonist, questioning what he is doing there and stating that he will regret having gotten mixed up with them, since their master is about to arrive. The protagonist, with an ironic smile, thanks him for the information and states that the man should worry more about his own life. The fight continues until the bald man, in a last breath, he dies and the protagonist, exhausted, prepares for the next stage. When the protagonist finally reaches the room where Diana's brother is, while the boy is scared, thinking he is another bandit. However, the protagonist quickly tries to calm him down, explaining that he is there at his sister's request, and that he does not need to be afraid. Aaron, still suspicious, asks for more explanations, but the protagonist promises that everything will be explained to get out of there. But before they can make any move, a vampire appears. An imposing being with a threatening aura. The vampire questions if the protagonist is responsible for the problems in his restaurant, and if he is playing with his food. The protagonist soon realizes that he is face to face with a vampire, and Seth asks if he is part of the Alliance of Destiny. The vampire, with a dark laugh, transforms into his true form, threatening the protagonist with his sharp claws. The protagonist, with the calm that is characteristic of him, responds that he is just an outsider, someone who was extorted by the vampire's subordinates, and who, upon finding the boy, decided to help him. Vampire, bored, says that he prefers younger boys as his meal and with that, advances against the protagonist. He uses a powerful sandy magic, which hits the protagonist and throws him to the ground. The impact breaks wine barrels around, but to the vampire's surprise, the boy seems intact. The protagonist, with difficulty, he recovers and, warning Aaron to run away and not look back, begins to face the vampire in combat. The vampire, immense and physically superior, attacks with his claws, piercing the protagonist's chest. He jokes, saying that the protagonist has recovery abilities, but deep down, he knows that the difference in power is immense. The vampire, unhurriedly, toys with his enemy, aware that, if he weren't having fun, he would have already finished him off. When the protagonist tries to get up, the vampire, with terrifying speed, rips off his arm, saying that he is getting tired of the fight, that now the protagonist would pay for everything he has done. But, in his mind, the protagonist does not give up. He knows that there is still one last card to play, one last chance to turn the game around with a desperate move. The protagonist bites the ring hidden in his mouth, and his body starts to catch fire, combusting. The vampire, surprised, asks if that is a magical fire tool, asking how he managed to put that in his mouth. The protagonist, thinking quickly, remembers that it was at the moment he was thrown to the ground near the boy and the spilled wine. What idea came to him? The alcohol spread around the environment would become the perfect fuel for his last attempt. The vampire, now prehensile, tries to push the protagonist away, stabbing his body to make him move away, but it is too late. A huge explosion occurs, generated by the combustion of the alcohol, and the protagonist, still with his body on fire, feels the pain of the explosion. But he also knows that it was the only way to take the vampire with him. Amidst the smoke and flames, the protagonist, visibly injured and exhausted, reflects on what happened. He observes his own physical resistance, thinking that, in the end, his mission was accomplished. Gianna was already with her brother, and he had accomplished what he set out to do. Later, the notification system warns that Vrines has died, but that his avatar will be reborn in 7 days. At another point, we see Gianna, now more willing, earning some money by addressing shoes. She seems calmer, but when a figure approaches and asks if she can provide the same services, she is surprised to see keener. With an emotional smile, she hugs the protagonist, believing that he really survived. The protagonist, still with a relaxed tone, responds that it is not easy to kill him, but deep down, he knows that his avatar's death was real this time. Meanwhile, the protagonist, now in his new form, reflects on how everything happened when he was reborn. He spent a week thinking about the best way to get close to Diana and protect her. He creates a new avatar, and this new body is endowed with acceleration abilities. In contrast to the resistance that the previous one had, the protagonist wonders if Diana would notice the difference, but upon seeing him and hugging him, she seems to feel that it is the same person, as if his soul was still present. Diana, with concern, warns him that he should not return to that city, because the vampires would certainly look for him. But the protagonist, confident, assures him that he doesn't need to worry, since with Hans the immortal king by his side, vampires are not a problem. Later, at an inn, while the protagonist observes his system, he realizes that he will need some time to recharge. But a mysterious figure observes the bat, now transformed into a vampire, from a distance. He approaches and grabs the protagonist's neck, recognizing him as Venus. The protagonist, realizing that this vampire is much stronger than the previous one, tries to react but feels that he is being completely immobilized. The vampire reveals that he feels dark magic coming from him, or accuses him of being someone different, questioning if he is part of the convention of destiny. The protagonist, feeling the transformation in his body, realizes that he is now acquiring abilities of full vampiric descent, but at the same time maintains control over his mind. The vampire, after biting him, asks once again if the protagonist really doesn't know about his origins. The protagonist with difficulty ignores the call of the keeping his conscience intact. The vampire, realizing he was wrong, decides to have the protagonist follow him, because now something important is being done. The protagonist, without missing a chance, thinks he can gather more information about his enemies while following the vampire. Later, at Anto's headquarters, the vampire who transformed the protagonist, Lord Virict, is greeted by his followers. They begin to whisper about the Lord's new Sinev. The protagonist, a Dorota, approaches him, introduces herself as Rosala, and with a smile greets him, asking his name. The protagonist, now in an environment full of vampires, finds himself involved in a tense situation with Ros. She, relaxed, offers him a fresh sanguine, as if it were a common drink, and he, afraid of raising suspicions, accepts the invitation. But when drinking the sundae, the prota feels something unexpected, and deep in his body every nerve in him cries out for more sundae, and he feels completely overcome by thirst. In a desperate attempt to maintain control, he blocks his senses of smell and taste with the center of his mind, drinking the contents of the glass without showing weakness. Despite his mind warning him of danger, she thanks Rosala, who enthusiastically says that he is exactly the type of vampire she likes. A prota, taking the opportunity to learn more about the world around him, asks about the hierarchy of vampires. Rosal explains that there are several categories. The Sandinarians are like knights among vampires. The pure Sandys are the nobles like Lord Virik. And the true Sandys are royalty, with the sacred Sens being almost like gods. She also reveals that the sacred Sens are the progenitors of vampires, the elders who rule over all, and that every vampire must obey these beings. The protagonist, still processing the information, is surprised to realize that he is in the middle of a power game that he barely understands. In the midst of these revelations, Ward will come and interrupt the conversation, tapping the glass and calling everyone's attention to discuss more pressing matter. He talks about the fragment of the Immortal King, an artifact that was lost and probably hidden in the city, which arouses the curiosity of the. Realizing that he had also dealt with the cult that cultivated magical fragments, Prota questions whether the vampires are after these fragments as well. Lord will come to coordinate that everyone invest the city in search of clues, because it puts Prota on alert. Meanwhile, Rosilla suggests that they go out to investigate, as exposure to the sun could be fatal for them. Prota, tired and already beginning to feel the effects of the vampiric transformation, agrees, but becomes increasingly skeptical about what is really happening. During the conversation with Rosilla, he discovers that one of the vampire blood fragments may be in the possession of someone very important, possibly one of the pure Deliberate. He tries to get more information, but Rosilla has fun with his questions, laughing and saying that she does not know where the fragment is. Later, when meeting Diana, the protagonist is surprised by an unexpected revelation. Diana, with a serious look, says that she thinks she knows where the fragment is. She remembers an event that happened a year ago when she worked cleaning tombs. She says that every Friday, a vampire would appear in a specific cemetery and always felt an evil and rotten energy in the air. The protagonist, impressed by this information, begins to realize that she may actually be on the right track. Meanwhile, in the cemetery, a brutal scene takes place. A vampire is having fun and torturing a human, using blood ties to bind his victim. And in a few seconds, the man's life energy is drained, leaving only a dry corpse. The impatient vampire orders his servants to remove the body and bring a new sacrifice when suddenly an army of skeletons emerges, running towards the group of vampires. The vampire leader, Cheap, asks where these skeletons are coming from, but soon realizes that they are being controlled by dark magic. The necromancer responsible for the magic, Hans, is revealed to be the one truly responsible for the invasion, and the vampire, Fury, tries to crush the skeletons with his brute strength. Hans, however, is not intimidated. He uses magic to transform the broken bones into deadly spikes, demonstrating that he is a formidable opponent and that he is willing to fight to the end. Sheeran did not expect to be taken by surprise, but what really leaves him panicking is when a skeleton emerges from the ground and begins to hold him, confronted by a vampire, who appears to help him. But Cheap, suspicious, he asks how the vampire knew about the situation. The vampire replies that it was reinforcements sent by Lord Vac. Already aware of the impending war in that cemetery, Cheap, relieved, he accepts the help. But the situation takes an unexpected turn. The vampire bites suddenly. The protagonist, in disguise, finally reveals his identity, Chaya. In a moment of pure disbelief and rage, he rants about the inadmissibility of a being as inferior as himself sweating his blood. Cheap's reaction is desperate, calling the act cannibalism. But in a few seconds, the vampire's blood drains away, and Chip turns into a dry corpse. His protagonist, Calm, comments that this mental corruption doesn't work on him, before using his new ability, Sandy's magic, to break the barriers that restrict him. The system informs him that he has acquired a new ability that makes everything much easier for him. Meanwhile, Hyde prepares to collect the second fragment of the Immortal King, but the crystal, like a shield, repels his approach. He realizes that the fragment in question is much more intense than a previous one, and decides to use the mental power of his 3 crones to absorb the emanated energy. The pressure is felt by everyone, including the vampires outside the tomb. Lord Vac distantly realizes that he may be late. When Hans finally emerges from the tomb, an intense confrontation ensues, reinforced by dark magic. He ignores Sandy's spells thrown at him and quickly eliminates a vampire. But what really scares Lord is the revelation that Han has become an Orculite, now possessing 2 of the 3 fragments of the Immortal King. This grants him immeasurable power, beyond the forbidden knowledge of black magic. Lord Vac, faced with the new reality, realizes that Hans now has unquestionable immortality, and questions how he endured so much energy at that moment. The protagonist approaches the system records that he has reached the conditions for evolution, and his ability to